Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if you can really trust what you think you know about how different personality traits are connected? Well, this new study dives deep into that very question, and it turns out our common sense ideas might not always be the full story. Today we're exploring a fascinating study that uses a super cool statistical tool called Bayes factors to look at the relationships between hidden aspects of our personalities or abilities, which they call latent variables. Think of latent variables as the underlying traits that influence the things we can actually measure, like how well you score on a test or how you answer a survey. The researchers want to know if one latent trait is truly independent of another, meaning they don't influence each other, even when we account for everything else going on. The problem with a lot of traditional ways of studying these connections is that they're not great at telling us when something isn't there. For example, a statistical test might say, we don't have enough evidence to say these two things are related, but that doesn't necessarily mean they aren't related. It just means the study didn't find strong proof. It is like saying, I haven't seen Bigfoot versus I've proven Bigfoot doesn't exist. This new research uses a Bayesian approach, which is all about updating our beliefs as we see new evidence, and specifically uses something called Bayes factors to give us a number that tells us how much the data favors one idea over another. They want to know if a connection between two underlying traits is truly absent or just hard to detect. So what did they do? They built on something called the Latent Network Model, or LNM. Imagine a set of underlying traits, like different kinds of intelligence. The LNM tries to map out how these traits are connected, but the old way of doing this, using things like penalties or significance testing, can't really distinguish between no connection found and the connection is definitely not there. That is where their new Bayesian Latent Network Model, or BLNM, comes in. They set up a system where they can put prior beliefs about these connections and then use the data to update those beliefs. The core of their new method is the inclusion Bayes factor. This factor helps them directly compare two possibilities for any given connection between latent variables. Either the connection is there or it is not. A Bayes factor greater than 1 means the data supports the idea that the connection is present, while a value less than 1 favors the idea that the connection is absent. They can even calculate an exclusion Bayes factor, which is just the flip side of that, telling us how much the data supports the absence of a connection. To test their method, they looked at two real-world datasets. The first was the classic Holzinger's-Weinfurt data, which is about different types of student abilities. They found that for the connection between textual and speed ability, the traditional statistical tests just said not significant, meaning they couldn't confidently say there was a link. But their Bayes factor approach gave them a value that actually supported the idea that these two abilities are conditionally independent, meaning they don't really affect each other once you account for other abilities, like visual ability. This is a really neat example of how their method can provide positive evidence for the absence of a relationship, which is something the older methods struggle with. Then they moved on to a much larger data set, the Big 5 personality traits. This involved over 2,400 people and looked at 5 major personality dimensions: agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism, and openness. With so many potential connections between these traits, it becomes a really complex puzzle. Their analysis revealed some strong connections, like between agreeableness and extroversion, and also found evidence for the absence of connections. For example, they found that openness to experience seems to be conditionally independent of both agreeableness and neuroticism once you consider the other Big 5 traits. This means that within the context of the other personality dimensions, knowing someone's level of openness doesn't really tell you much about their agreeableness or neuroticism. To really put their method to the test, they ran a big simulation study. They created artificial data where they knew exactly which connections were truly there and which were absent. They compared their BLNM method to a simpler two-step approach where researchers might first estimate factor scores, basically scores representing the latent traits, and then analyze those scores using standard network methods. What they found was pretty stark. Their BLNM method was very good at correctly identifying absent connections, and rarely falsely concluded that a connection was present when it wasn't. The two-step method, however, was much more prone to making mistakes, especially when the measurements weren't perfectly reliable. It often falsely found connections that weren't really there. And this problem didn't get better with larger sample sizes, which is a big red flag. This simulation highlights a crucial point: how we handle measurement error and the underlying latent variables really matters. The two-step approach, by simplifying things and treating estimated scores as if they were perfect measurements, can lead to misleading conclusions. Their BLNM. by integrating the measurement and network models into one seamless process, provides a more accurate and reliable picture. So, what is the big takeaway from all of this new Bayesian approach? The BLNM offers a powerful way to explore the complex relationships between latent variables. It doesn't just tell us when a connection is likely present, but it can also provide evidence for when a connection is truly absent. This is incredibly important for building more accurate models of psychological phenomena. They emphasize that the evidence for absence accumulates much more slowly than evidence for presence, and quantifying this asymmetry is key to making sound scientific claims. One of the neat things about this research is how it bridges the gap between traditional structural equation modeling, which focuses on latent variables, and network modeling, which focuses on direct relationships. By applying network ideas to latent variables, they can explore complex structures without being constrained by predefined causal pathways. And because the latent space is usually smaller than the observed variable space, they can actually check all possible network structures, which is a huge advantage for certainty. Of course, no study is perfect. The researchers acknowledge that their method still relies on the assumption that the observed indicators for a latent variable are conditionally independent of each other, except through that latent variable. They also mention that interpreting centrality of a latent variable can be tricky, and their method treats the indicators as continuous, even if they might be ordinal. These are important points for future research to build upon. Now, for my take on this research, I think this is a really significant step forward for understanding complex psychological constructs. The ability to get positive evidence for the absence of a relationship is a game changer. It moves us beyond simply not finding something and closer to understanding what truly isn't there. The simulation results are particularly compelling, showing that the shortcuts can be quite misleading. This highlights the importance of using methods that properly account for measurement error and the structure of latent variables. In the real world, this could mean more accurate models of personality, intelligence, and even mental health conditions. Imagine better understanding how different symptoms relate to each other, or how different personality traits interact in people struggling with certain challenges. This research provides a more robust tool for those explorations. For future research, I'd love to see how this method can be applied to even more complex models, perhaps incorporating ordinal data more directly or exploring residual networks alongside latent networks. The potential to uncover more nuanced relationships in psychology is immense. What do you think about these findings? Does this change how you think about the connections between different aspects of your own personality or abilities? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the science of connections, please give this video a like, share it with your curious friends, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more breakdowns of fascinating research. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.